we started the Rainforest Information Centre in the late 70s. We took part in what we realised years later was the first direct action in defence of rainforests, not only in Australia but anywhere in the world. And I was just there by sheer fluke. I happened to be living a few kilometres down the road from Terania Creek, where some neighbours appealed for help at the local, at the Channon Market one Sunday, saying that the Forestry Commission was coming in the next day to log the rainforest. I didn't know that there was a rainforest at the end of Terania Creek Road. I'd never gone to the end of Terania Creek Road. I didn't know that there were rainforests in Australia, but I was interested in community and in neighbourhood, and so curiosity and neighbourliness, I suppose. I was there, and something happened to me there which I still haven't recovered from. And that happened to a lot of people at the time, and as a result of that, what started with a couple of hundred hippies from Nimbin and around there very quickly became a national movement, and in less than 2 years an opinion poll found that more than 70% of the people of New South Wales wanted an end to rainforest logging, and Neville Wran's government legislated with a string of national parks stretched from the Border Ranges down to Barrington Tops, and that included Nightcap National Park with our little few hundred hectares of Terania Creek, where we'd been climbing up into trees and getting arrested for a couple of years.
Do you want to have some water?
So we went on from there. That was the subtropical rainforest in New South Wales. We went on to help in the campaign to protect the temperate rainforests in Tasmania. We got I guess there was no emails in those days, so it must have been a letter from a group that was then known as the Tasmanian Wilderness Society, run by a dole bludger called Bob Brown, and asking us if we'd come down and help set up a blockade to stop the damming of the Franklin River that would have flooded the heart of the temperate rainforest wilderness in the southwest of Tasmania. And a couple of combi loads of freaks from Nimbin went down there, and we helped set up the base camp at Strawn and taught everybody, as they came upriver to get arrested, we taught them the songs that we'd composed around the fires at Terania Creek, and that turned into the biggest such event in Australian history. More than 3,000 people came from all over the country, more than 1,500 people were arrested. And you were arrested. Great. Every audience, there's always someone who was arrested at the Franklin River. Yes, I was arrested too. And 2 years later, we were up at the Daintree for the tropical rainforests, and once again, our efforts were rewarded with national parks and eventual World Heritage listing. So that was a very empowering start to life as a rainforest activist. We started the Rainforest Information Centre, a group of volunteers to sound the alarm and try and do something about what was happening to rainforests elsewhere in the world. And then in 1984, I was invited to the United States by a radical environment group called Earth First, which decided that they wanted to have a rainforest campaign, so I went over there, and shortly after that met Dana and others at one of the Earth First's festivals, as he said. At about that time we received, again it must have been a letter from a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador called Jaime Levy. He'd somehow heard about the Rainforest Information Centre, and he was working with an indigenous community called the Awa, who lived on a few 100,000 hectares of pristine tropical rainforest on the Colombian border, and he wanted some help. Their rainforests were threatened, could we help? And one of our volunteers, Doug Ferguson, went over there, and he actually spent the next 7 years over there, married a succession of Ecuadorian women, and was probably the most successful of all of our group in terms of just sheer huge numbers of rainforests that got protected as a result of his work. And one of those rainforests was the Los Cedros Biological Reserve up in the Andes, about 5 hours from Quito. And we were able to get a grant from the Australian government to help establish that biological reserve, and the Ecuadorian government at the time was so flabbergasted. I don't think they'd ever heard of the Australian government, and they were so amazed that they handed over the title to the rest of the Los Cedros Plateau to our group, and so we've been looking after that, about 11,000 hectares ever since. And we've been saving it from one threat after the other. When it's not illegal logging or poaching, it's land developers and you name it. And then 2 years ago, someone sent us a press release from a Canadian mining company, the Cornerstone Corporation, that claimed to have a mining lease on Los Cedros, and we were like, impossible. And as we researched it, we discovered that the Office of Strategic Sectors, run by the then Vice President, whose name was Glass, and who was jailed in February this year for 6 years for corruption, they had given out, secretly had given out concessions on nearly 2 million hectares of protected land, including Los Cedros and including more than 1 million hectares of indigenous territories. And so our efforts to protect Los Cedros turned into this huge campaign to protect all of these areas, because there didn't seem to be any way to protect Los Cedros without protecting the lot. And so when I heard Dana was coming over, I said, you've got to help us. And so this is the first of 3 benefits that Dana will be doing here and on the Central Coast and up on the North Coast, where we're raising money for protecting Los Cedros and those other areas. We've had a lot of great support. Paul Gilding, who was once the director of Greenpeace in Australia and then went on to be the director of Greenpeace International, he pledged $15,000 on a dollar-for-dollar basis, that for every dollar that we raised up to $15,000 he would match it, and we're up to $9,000 with that. And so whatever we're raising on these concerts will go towards that as well. So thanks so much, Dana, and thanks everyone. One of the culprits in the whole Ecuador scenario is the World Bank, which is an old enemy of ours that we've had to deal with over and over again over the years. And once, a long time ago, I wrote a song about the World Bank, which I'd like to share with you. In this case, about 6 or 7 years ago, they spent some millions of dollars funding a project doing geological surveys of protected areas around Ecuador, so that the mining companies were armed with all of this geological information, which should never have been, those studies should never have been done. These were national parks and protected areas and so on. And so we're suggesting that if we can have the concessions rescinded, and the mining companies no doubt will want to get compensated for their losses, that it's the World Bank that should be paying that compensation. So we'll see how we go. Emanating from expensive business suits, do you notice odors foul and rank? With his ecocide, genocide numbers game, here comes the World Bank. Needle dripping dollars, clutching his structural adjustment knife. Ecosystem after system is plundered, laid to waste from the earth. He sucks the life. Teeth rip vital organs from the living earth, spitting out cellulose chips. How generous he greases all his minions' palms. His card reads ecological collapse. Economists from hell, smooth the way, run interference, quelling all your fears. With administrators, bureaucrats just doing my job, and all those damn engineers. World Bank's got an evil junkie wife, goes by the name of IMF. Shoots up biological diversity, dispenses cultural death. Mumbling about sustainable development, she plies her vicious trade. Then if you see her coming, better run for your life. There's an S on the end of her Asian, African, American development banks are World Bank's ugly cronies three, with their friends the scumbag loggers from the FAO and the mafia from the UNDP. They loot the biological register with their tropic forest action plan. Scorched earth transmigration, chemicals, agribusiness, logging, mines and dams. Propping up current third world elites, choke the rivers with the endless dams. Keeping all them foreign experts employed with their paid for by your taxes scams. Rape the earth to meet the interest payments, it's that same old shell game. Centuries of exploitation and they still owe us colonialism by another name. The time has come to clean up this town, name names, flush out those crooks. Biological fabric in tatters, the World Bank cooks the books. Wake up now, won't you hear the cries of this planet of your birth? Expose the lies, no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. I said stop the lies, no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. So when we first got involved with Los Cedros about 30 years ago, the whole of northwest Ecuador, most of it was covered in this most incredible rainforest, cloud forest, possibly the most biodiverse spot on Earth, arguably the most biodiverse spot on Earth. In the meantime, through one threat after another, most of that has disappeared. So that Los Cedros now, according to Professor Bitty Roy from the University of Oregon, one of the many researchers who has studied there, Los Cedros is now the most forested watershed in the whole of western Ecuador. And so Bitty Roy and her colleagues have published 2 scientific papers recently about the likely impacts of this mining. And, foremost among these is the extinction of species. Many of the species that exist in Los Cedros exist nowhere else, and vast extinctions will take place if this mining goes ahead. And so the second and final song that I'd like to share with you is a song that I wrote up at Cape Tribulation up in North Queensland during the blockade there in 1986, and it's called Extinction. And for those of you that aren't old enough to remember 1986, there's a couple of parts of the song that perhaps I should explain. The first is that Cape Trib was known as, hello, welcome, was the rainforest that we're working in, and that in this song I refer to Yellow Cake Bob, and Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister at the time, and back towards the end of the Second World War, the then Prime Minister, another Bob called Bob Menzies, was selling pig iron to the Japanese, which returned as bombs dropping on Darwin, and so he became known popularly as Pig Iron Bob at the time. And so Yellow Cake was the uranium ore that Bob Hawke was mining from Roxby Downs uranium mine in South Australia, and so we dubbed him Yellow Cake Bob. So Yellow Cake Bob appears in this song. Oh yes, there's just one thing more. Extinction howls outside the door, and no matter what they say, it's a hell of a price to pay for security. And when you see Cape Trib tumbling down, ask yourself what's real, estate agent or genie pool. A nuclear umbrella shields my soul. Yellow cake bomb got my vote. Rocks me down this pays wage or dole, to be or not to be. The final choice, ecology or extinction. Raise your voice. Ever since they heard the news, sisters and brothers sing the blues. Share despair, fear and sorrow, loving each other like there's no tomorrow. For yesterday we pray, may there be peace on earth. Ecology, ecstasy, evolution. Sap coursing through a mammal branch touches you, a trembling human leaf. Send your roots back through the tree of life. Shedding false humanistic beliefs, you fall to your knees. In some still natural place, embrace the trees, feel ecology is your heart. Oh yes, there's just one thing more. Extinction howls outside the door, and no matter what they say, it's a